Okay, so this is going to be the portion of the video for finishing up the ball bounce. Just as a review for in real time, we'll be covering this split up over Monday and Tuesday for the video. It's going to be squash and stretch combined with our rotation in one video. So the rotation will be coming after I'm done with the squash and stretch portion, which is what we're covering today. So because of that, we don't really need to add any. There's no crazy new info that we need to do our squash and stretch portion. Tomorrow we'll be covering the graph editor and using that a little bit to finalize our ball bounce. So for us, again, we're just opening up our ball bounce, and for this portion, you should have already gone through and done your translate keyframes. Before you start doing this next step, I will also caution you that you're going to want to make sure that your timing is finalized for your translate step, as the rest of the keyframes will sort of, of line with where those things fall in time. So make sure that your timing is right before you start doing this next step. And so what I did earlier, which I did not save, so I'll be doing it again on the video. So if you watch this back, it's going to lag because I have a lot of visual load on my computer. Oh, you know what? I am going to turn off my camera while I do this to sort of reduce my visual load. So on my computer, on my end. So and so the timing is it's pretty good. Now again, if you're following the reference, which on most work you won't be able to do stuff like this, but with this, where the frames were every 2 frames was a drawing on here, or a circle. So we more or less got the timing right just by following the image. Now, I did do a little bit of goofiness on some of the counting and stuff, and there's also just taking into account, hey, make some tweaks to make it look right. Don't, just because that's what the drawing says, don't just follow that. So I think what I did is in between here and here, I took out one of the I removed it in between here and here. I removed it in between here. So I basically moved the end of my bounce forward to frame 22 and sort of shifted a few things. Again, just get it what looks right for you. So I'll play this through. Boom. And so I think on the way up here, I'm going to want to remove a in between in here. Get this sped up a little bit. And then on the way back down, speed it up a little bit. So I'm just removing one frame at a time. I'm not doing anything nuts. And what I also did there, just to point out, is I removed one frame on the part of the bounce from the bottom going up towards the top. And then I went on the other side of it and did one headed back towards the bottom. And so I removed one on either side of the bounce. And then yeah, I'm definitely going to remove an in-between in here. Speed that up. I'll speed this up. Okay. And one thing I want to point out to you is that there's still things that we're going to be tweaking with how this looks. With the stuff that we fix tomorrow. So part of it is that when the ball is hitting the ground, it's sort of doing a little U shape there, trying to round out the bottom of the bounce, when in actuality it should be striking the ground and then rebounding. And so that is something that we'll be able to fix tomorrow with the graph editor. So it is going to have a little bit of goofiness at the bottom, but timing wise, that looks pretty good. So we're going to roll with that from here. So again, before you start doing the squash and stretch, make sure your keyframes for your timing for the translate are all good to go. All right, so now that we know that that is all set, our timing is good. In fact, I'm going to save now. So overwrite all that. So going forward from there, let's take it all the way back to frame 1. I'm going to zoom in on my ball. Actually, I'm going to go out here in the 3D space just because it's easier to see from out here. So I got my ball. When I'm selected on the rig, I can see all these red channels. These are my translate, rotate stuff we've been working with. There's also the custom channels that were added that edit the geometry. So for us, we are going to work with our squash controller, which is separate from the main rig controller. So show squash is set to 0. This is a true false variable, and so you're going to want to change true false show squash to 1 and hit enter, and now you'll get this little UFO looking disc. Okay, so you'll see this squash control has no keyframe set on it. It's nice and clean. It also has this custom value called squash, which allows you to stretch and squash the ball pretty obnoxiously. Okay? So that's what we're going to be working with for our squash and stretch. So let me go. Now that I have this, again, let me undo. Okay. So I'm on my main rig. Again, to display the squash controller, you change show squash to 1 and hit enter. Then you'll see the little gray UFO and go ahead and click on that because that's what we're working with for this part. Okay? So as you might have guessed, we're going to start with a keyframe on frame 1. Just hit S. Just set a keyframe, lock it in for the start. So for our squash and stretch, we're mostly concerned about the point at the top of the bounce, which is what we're doing now, where the ball is at its neutral state, so where the pull of gravity is equivalent to the other forces exerted on it, so the ball is round. And then when the ball is close to the ground, when acceleration forces will be stretching the ball out, or when the ball is touching the ground and the energy is compressing the ball into a squashed state. So that's what we're worried about, either at the very top of the bounce or at the bottom of the bounce is basically all we're working with today. So let me go into my side view. I have my squash control selected. Go into my side view here. So I can just scroll through on my timeline here, find the frame where the ball bounces off the ground, which I know to be frame 22. And what I'm going to do is first I need to switch to my move tool and move the squash controller, the little disc, to the bottom of the ball. And the reason why you need to do that is that the ball compresses itself towards that disc. So by putting it on the bottom, when I change the squash value, it will stretch away from that disc or it will squish onto that disc. So that basically sets a ground for our ball. And in fact, I'm going to go out of squash, or a ground plane, after I do the squash. So for my squash, this is us working with, which we'll be talking about as sort of a retrospective next week on Monday, about one of the 12 principles of animation, the very first of which is squash and stretch. So the illusion of physical forces on your object. So we're going to be exerting, acceleration forces on our ball as it falls towards the ground, gravity pulling on it, acceleration forces, etc. But also, as animators, we need to use another one of our 12 principles, again, talking about this next week, exaggeration. So it's okay if your ball bounce looks a little cartoony today and it's a little excessive. So squash and stretch, I'm going to select the word squash, and then to scroll a channel's value, again, you select the channel name, hold down the middle mouse button and drag, and then so I'm going to want to squish down my ball here at the bottom of the bounce. And so I'm going to go with a negative 0.3. Oh, seems good to me. And again, I have my value set. I have my rig selected on my time. I'll hit S to lock that keyframe in. Now, let's take a look at what we've done. So from frame 1, you'll now see that this ball starts squishing in the middle of the air, which is not what it should be doing. Sorry, my stomach's growling. I'm trying to make it through. So, here we are just before the ball is supposed to be touching the ground and compressing. So at this point in the bounce, the ball should be stretching towards the ground as it accelerates towards the ground. And then it will squash when that force meets the ground and compresses. So here, I'm on frame 20. I'm 2 frames before it touches the ground. It's telling me it's at a negative 0.92 here, so I'm going to just go the other way and make this a positive 0.28 and hit enter. And so now you can see my ball is stretched out. Now, one other issue with this is that my ball is just stretching vertically up and down. So I also, here at the bottom of the bounce, on my stretch keyframe, I need to angle this disc so that it's stretching in the direction that it is falling from. So just angle this a little bit so that it follows the trajectory. And then, so again, I've set my squash value and my rotate value for my squash disc. Hit S to lock it in. So now if I zoom out, we can see the ball stretches in midair. Boom. And then same concept, 2 frames afterwards, I'm going to have it so that the ball is again at a positive value. Again, it's hitting the ground, so it's transferring energy. That's why the ball is losing height on each of its bounces. So instead of it squashing back out to a positive 0.28, go with a positive 0.25. Mathematically, you can figure this stuff out, but we're just eyeballing it, folks. And same concept though, rotate it a little bit so that it follows the arc that it should be traveling along. I'm going to hit S to lock that in. And before I play this for you, I'm going to just go up, find the top of my bounce here. So right here, frame 40 it looks like. And all you'll do is go up to your values up here. I'm going to replace a 0 for my squash, a 0 for my rotate. Leave the translate Y. The translate Y is good. So that one you can just leave alone. But I'll reset my rotate and my squash, hit S, and set my keyframe. So now you can see I have 1 frame at the top, 3 frames at the bottom, a stretch, a squash, and a stretch. So if we play this back, now for right now, it's going to look a little weird because the ball is sort of bouncing on its butt as it goes forward. That's what we're going to fix tomorrow when we add a smooth rotate throughout the whole animation. So again, you can see how the ball stretches towards the ground, recoils, bounces back up, neutralizes out, and so again, we're going to find the bottom of this bounce. Looks like at frame 56. And just follow the same pattern. So first I'll set this here. Squash value, squish it down a little bit. So maybe a negative 0.2, negative 0.25. Let's go with that. We'll lock that in at S. And then I'll go 2 frames before that. We'll get this nice and stretched out. So positive 0.25. And also, let's not forget to rotate it in the direction of our bounce angle. Hit S to frame that up or lock that in. Boom, boom. 2 frames this way. Let's go with a positive 0.2. Tilt this towards the direction of our next bounce and lock it in. Oh, I did that 1 frame afterwards. So I'm going to do 2 frames ahead. Okay. And so again, we'll find the ball at the top of the bounce, and we're just going to reset our squash value again, reset our rotate value again, and hit S to lock that in. So we've done 2 bounces so far. So again, it's 1 at the top, 3 at the bottom, 1 at the very bottom where it's squashing, and then 2 on either side of the bounce, coming out of the previous bounce and into the next bounce. So let's take a look at this so far. All right. So let me tidy up with one more bounce. So we got this here. Yeah, it looks like frame 81. We're gonna hit this with a squash. I would also note, if you hold down Control while you're scrolling a channel's value, it will scroll by hundredths instead of tenths. So I can scroll this and squish it down negative 0.16 if I want. Or I could just type it in at this point because I can't get it right. Fine. Okay. Set my keyframe. Let's go 2 frames before that. We'll go ahead and put in a, let's say, a positive 0.17. Whoa, that's not what I put in. 0.17. There we go. Rotate this back the way it came. In fact, I think that's probably way too much. I think it's kind of comical. I think that's kind of comical. Here, I'll be a little bit more sane. I'll set it to 0.15 on my stretch, then my squash, and then going back out this way, I'm going to point it at positive 0.11, rotate it up, keyframe, find the top of this bounce here. It looks like it's at frame 89. Zero that out once again. Hit keyframe. All right, so let's take it back to the start, and you folks can see. Eventually, folks, you should be having like no bounce or no squash and stretch needed. All right, so again, 1 keyframe at the top, no squash, no rotate needed on the squash disc. Then you get to the bottom and set your squash keyframe. Again, a little bit, make sure that the squash controller is set to the bottom of the ball. Use this squash value, set it to some negative number for the squash, and then you would go 2 frames before that, fix it up with a positive stretch number, and also rotate the disc. And then on the same thing in the other direction, although once it struck the ground, remember it's dissipated energy, so the number when it is rebounding and stretching away from the ground should be slightly lower than the value, the negative value, I would say, for the squash. So it should be losing value in your squash as it continues to bounce, as that energy dissipates and the ball starts losing its bounciness and stuff. So that is the representation of the ball's energy in motion, in transit, basically. So what you will do, go through, activate your squash control, and for each one of these bounces, control for the stretch into the ground, the squash at the bottom, and the rebound away. Reset it at the top of each bounce, so just 1 keyframe there. 3 at the bottom, 1, 3 at the bottom, 1, 3 at the bottom, and then finish it out. At the end, you shouldn't need any squash and stretch, right? It should just bounce here, right? So thank you for watching this portion. I'm going to Martha Stewart this into the beginning of tomorrow's lecture on how to finish up with the rotate and to fix the little bit of bending at the bottom of the translate Y, where Maya is trying to add a spline at the bottom. So all stuff coming in Graph Editor, which is part 2 of our lecture tomorrow, starting right now in the video. So thanks for watching. Okay, folks, welcome. We're continuing our great march to victory as we finish up our ball bounce. So today we're going to take a step forward into something a little bit more advanced than what we've been working with. We are going to become lords of physics today by working within the Graph Editor, which is just a visual way of looking at the keyframes and what is changing over time at those keyframes. So what is the Graph Editor? It's just a window that's going to display the change of a channel's value, so whatever thing that we're messing with, on the y-axis over the period of time, so that time is on the x-axis for whatever you have selected. So here's my ball bounce, right? Let's go back to frame 1, right? Okay, great. Oops, that's my squash disk. There we go. So here I'm selected on my ball rig. I'm going to go to Windows, Animation Editor, and right at the top is the Graph Editor. And then you'll get this window that looks like this. So the Graph Editor, like I said, it's just what is the change for a particular channel. So you can see this is my translate Y values. So it's the lowest it goes is 14, the highest it goes is 42. And then it's graphing that change over time. And you can see my time axis is written up here, right? How many frames is it? You can see that there's one of these for each of my channels that's on my object. So there's translate Z, translate Y, translate X. We don't have any translate X because our ball isn't moving left and right. We got rotate X, rotate Y, and rotate Z, which we haven't added the rotation yet. So we'll touch on those later. You'll also see this like 1, 2, 3 and gimbal control. Don't touch. Those are not for you. Don't touch them. Do not touch these things down here. So I'm just going to make them smaller. Boom. Okay. Don't touch those. Right? So the graph editor. What is it that we're working on in the graph editor? Basically, like I said, so it's the keyframes that are showing where our channel's value is at a particular time. Well, this graph is showing us the transition between those values over time and the shape of what that curve looks like. So what we are working on in here are the tangents, the entry and exit of the curves through keyframes, which is just to say a particular value at a particular time. So how does our control approach that and enter that value? So what is the acceleration or deceleration in the change of that value entering that point in time and moving beyond that point in time to the next keyframe? So that is what we're working with. So to change that, there are 4 settings for what we would call the tangent handles. So let's take a look on our translate Y. So these are all of our keyframes, and you can see it mostly looks like our up and down, just like it looks in the 3D view. Should make sense, right? So that all being said, you can see if I click on one of these points, there is what we call a tangent handle attached to it. And these tangent handles control how that value is affected as it enters that point in time. So with doing this, you can see how I'm destroying the curve basically. So it's going to approach this point, as it's approaching this point in time where it's supposed to be this value, because I've jacked up the tangent, now it's going to go past that point in space and then go back in space to approach that location at the appropriate time. So take a look at how this looks now. Whoops, let me minimize this. So now see how it does a little loop-de-loop? So we're just changing how Maya is transitioning between these keyframes. How does it affect the change between particular keyframes over time? So obviously we don't want this effect, so I'm going to undo that. Undo. Okay, back to where we were. So typically you can see that the tangents, are mostly just dictating that, hey, you should move pretty smoothly between the keyframe before this one and the keyframe after this one, because that's what you're affecting, right? The stuff that's leading into it, ergo coming from the previous keyframe, and leading out of it, ergo going to the next keyframe. So ways that we can change how these things work. So what are the attributes of a tangent that we can mess with? The first one I will tell you is the type of tangent that it is. We won't be working with changing the different tangent types in here. The default type of tangent is a spline tangent, which is just to say it tries to curve, make things smooth between each of the keyframes. We don't always want smooth transitions between our keyframes, which you'll see in a second. So, but just so you know, default type of tangent is a spline, not something you're going to have to worry about this year, or with what we're doing, I should say. Weighted tangent. So what does a weighted tangent mean? And we'll talk about the graph editor menus when we go back to that. So I've included some pictures of what these look like. So this is, like you saw, default tangent. So if you weight a tangent, it will become a little bit longer. You'll also get this little square head at the end of it. Now what that means is that you can change the length and angle of the tangent handle when freed. What does that mean? So the angle is changing the basically acceleration and deceleration into that point in value at that time, I guess, because it's, I would say space, but rotating doesn't really count that. But you can also change how long or short that change in acceleration or deceleration takes. If you have a really long handle, you can affect it for a really long period of time. You have a really short handle, it will only tweak it a little bit. So if I take a look here, and go down to my bottom here, real quick. Okay. So down here, this is again a default tangent, so I'm going to go ahead and just go to my curves menu and weight these tangents. You'll see how my weight shows up, so I get little square handles. And what I can do is, now you can see I can widen out this curve. And now, as it approaches the bottom, of my bounce, see how it does this sort of U shape at the bottom? So that's because I changed my tangent width and widened out that curve at the bottom, so it does sort of a curved change in its Y value. So I zoom out, you can see how that's disfiguring the curve of this. All right, so let me undo that, because I obviously don't want that to happen. Okay, so that's what a weighted tangent does. You're able to change not just the angle of the approach of like the transition, so how linear or curved the acceleration curve is, but you can also change the length and the duration by changing the length of that force change that you're affecting on this. So I must stress again, you are manually editing physics, right? Changing the speed of acceleration and deceleration for things. The next thing. So great, we have a weighted tangent. Cool, we can tweak those things. You want to free the weight for whatever reason. I've been looking into this. Seems like weighted tangents by default also have a freed weight. I don't know if that's currently true, but it's like if you go to tangents, free tangent length. I mean, I was able to do this before, as you saw anyway, but now now it's even freer, I guess. I can stretch it way beyond what it should be. What if I lock the tangent length? Oh, it just locks to that length. Interesting. So, anyway, let me just undo that. So, free my tangent length. Yay, you can mess with this. So, not going to be super useful for what we're doing today. You are going to do it just because you should practice it, but you're mostly not going to have to really disfigure the laws of physics too much on this assignment, luckily. Okay. So, the final aspect of this. Great. My weight, I can change the duration of acceleration and deceleration. I can change the angle to affect whether it has linear or exponential or logarithmic acceleration or deceleration between the keyframes. So the final thing is, how do you make the tangents work independently on both sides of the keyframe? Why would we want to do that? Note, we are going to ignore, this is like those physics problems where they tell you to ignore certain novel physical factors, like ignoring air resistance or things like that. So for our case, we're going to ignore that there is a certain amount of friction that occurs when the ball hits the ground and compresses, and then when it comes to sit there for a second, a split second, blah, blah, blah. We're just gonna take those and be like, yeah, we're gonna kind of smudge those a little bit. So zooming in on this, what I would like to do is have my ball accelerate in a linear fashion until it hits the ground, because it should not start decelerating before it hits the ground. And then it should build up acceleration after it tries to leave the ground. So on this side of the bounce, I want it to just be sharp right into the ground, because it shouldn't try and decelerate before it hits the ground. All right, so let's go ahead and now under tangents, you'll now break the tangents. And so you'll see they get dotted lines. Now you can see I can affect this tangent handle independently of the other side of the tangent. So I could do something like this and mess up my tangent there. So what you would want to use that for instead, like I said, is to get this side of the tangent to linearly accelerate towards the ground. Now, what I said about the laws of physics, and we're going to ignore the little bit of friction, we're going to cheat that in. We're not going to account for it. We're going to cheat it in a little bit by mostly, instead of having this go straight up like this and having a straight linear rebound off the ground, I'm going to leave this sort of at like a 45-degree angle, so it does have to slow into that otherwise long ramp up to this. So we'll leave it a little bit like that. And what that will do oh, you know what? Hold on. I'm going to turn my camera off because that's been lagging my playback. Okay, there we go. So now there's a little bit of whoops, I did not mean to play it. As it hits the ground here, it's not going to quickly start accelerating back towards the top. It's got a little bit of a hang. It's got a little bit of a hang here before it starts picking up its speed again. And also because I freed the tangent length, I could also tweak this, freed the weight, so I can tweak this so it does decelerate a little bit. So, or doesn't accelerate as fast into its bounce. So, boom. Think that did not, I think it's a little much. So I'm going to tone this down. There we go. We want it to have that springiness at the bottom. So that just brings me to moving forward. So we're going to use the graph editor to fix the bottoms of our bounce. Again, as the ball's approaching the ground, it doesn't need to decelerate until it hits the ground, because it should be accelerating towards the ground and then, hit that resistance, and then its direction will change, right? So I'm going to move forward in time. Oh, I'm going to move my time slider like this. See how it's like only hovering? It's like shading my area where my time slider is. So that's kind of helpful. So again, I'm going to grab this. I'm going to go to the curves menu. So first thing, you'll find weighted tangents under curves. Then you'll go free the tangent length. Then, if you need to, which for the bottoms of the bounce you do need to, you break the tangents. You won't always need to break the tangents. In this case, you do. So I'm going to get this to be approaching in a linear fashion from this side. I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to see how that looks. Then I'm going to drag this back to 1. Boom. Nice. So then same concept. Come over here. Curves. Oh, they did weight the whole curve. Sorry, you only have to do curves weighted tangent once. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. Totally forgot about that. Yeah, so when you do weighted tangents, you only have to do it once because it weights the entire curve. So instead, I can just go over here, free tangent length, and break my tangents. And now I can do the same thing. On this side, it should linearly accelerate into this point. On this side, just leave it alone. Oh, you know what? I need to extend this. Okay, cool. So, again, you would continue that, finish up these bounces going out here so that you get that nice linear acceleration. Again, you just want to go through the list, go down the list. Again, you don't need to change the tangent type. It's going to stay spline. You're going to have to weight the curve. So that's going to be, you'll do it once and you won't have to do it again after that. You get the whole curve weighted. On the individual tangent that you select, you'll be able to free the weight, and you'll also be able to break the tangent for those specific keyframes. So again, you got to click on those tangent handles before you break them. All right, so great. You get all of these done on your translate Y. What's next, Mr. Meyer? So we got one problem. Our ball is scooting on its butt because it doesn't rotate. So how do we make it not scoot on its butt? How do we make it rotate? So I'm going to increase my timeline to 150-ish. I think that gets me everything. So, okay. So let me click on my main rig. There we go. And so I have my keyframes going from 1 to 137-ish, it looks like. Okay, great. So the main problem is, if I look at my rotate tool, is that I have a keyframe for my rotate X at all the same places that I have keyframes for my translate. Because when you hit S, it's keyframing all of the main attributes. Translate, rotate. Normally it would be scale, but they've removed scale from this object. You can't change the scale from the rig. There's a scale all function that you have to use for that, which doesn't get keyframed by default. So there's a bunch of blank rotate X keyframes. And again, I know it's rotate X because the red circle is in the direction that I want to spin it. So how do I get rid of these? There's two ways to delete keyframes for a specific channel at a specific time. So in my case, I'm going to select all of the keyframes because I don't want it to do on just one time. I want to do it to all of them. Up here in the channel box, you'll just go to the one where you don't want that keyframe to be there anymore. So in our case, it's rotate X. And I'm going to right click it and do delete selected. And so you'll see all of my keyframes still there. But if I go into my graph editor, no more rotate X because there's no rotate X keyframes anymore. So now I'm going to just go back to frame 1 and set a keyframe. And now you'll see in my graph editor, there's my buddy rotate X again. Now, and also let me just undo real quick. So you can't actually, redo. You can't actually just click and select and delete all of these keyframes except the first one in here too, and that will do the same thing. But one way or another, delete all the rotate X keyframes. Then what you're going to do is find a good value for your rotate. So in my case, I am going to set my rotate to end at like 155, and you'll see why in a second. So I'm going to rotate this a little bit on the X. So it's telling me it's going in the negative direction. So what does negative 800 look like on this bad boy? Let's see what negative 800 looks like. If I look at my graph editor, And I'm going to hit F. Oh, I didn't set my keyframe. Haha! Set your keyframes, folks. Don't forget to tip your waitresses and set your keyframes. All right, there we go. So you can see I have just one big long graph from frame 1 all the way to my last frame at frame 150. So this is going to change the deceleration of my my rotate as well as my acceleration. So let's see what this looks like now with 800 or negative 800 degrees, I should say, of rotation. What does that look like? So you can see how at the end there is still a little bit of rotate while there is no movement. That's because I'm going to go add a little bit of roll off at the very, very, very end. So I don't like how much it rotated. I think it needs to rotate a little more. I think it's a little dry. So I'm going to go click on my rig again. Let's go to 155 here. I'm going to do negative 1100. I'm going to hit S, lock that in. So what does that look like this time? There we go. All right, so now we need to mess with how this translates. So this ball should, whoops, what did I do? Undo. So on my rotate X, okay, so this, I'm going to go ahead and weight my tangent because I haven't weighted this curve yet. So on this guy, we have this weight. I'm going to just tweak it down a hair, which is going to pick up the beginning of the acceleration for this, just a touch. What I'm also going to do, though, is I'm going to lessen the super slowness here at the end for the rotate. And also, before I show this on frame 155, I'm going to add one more little translate keyframe here at the end for my roll off. So just a hair. So short movement in space, but lots of time, slow action. So let me zoom back out. And so if I go back to the top, let's take a look at what that looks like. There you go. And you can see the ball comes to the rest at the end. So on this one, whoops, happened again. Dude, what is this? Be careful trying to select the main rig because you might just select the squash control over and over, which is why when you're done doing your squash and stretch, you should turn it off because otherwise it gets in the way. Okay, there we go. So let's zoom it out, take a peek. Okay, bum 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 bum. And so I think I'm going to take another crack at spinning this a little bit quicker at the top. And one thing I want to point out to you folks, you may want to use F. F as in frame. That will help you reset your graph space in here. Say if you're like zoomed in way over here, and you're like working on something, you can click in the background, hit F, it'll frame up that graph again. F as in frame. And so with that, folks, one final shot. Translate, rotate, squash and stretch, married together. The end of it, the squash and stretch isn't done. Just remember that. I didn't finish it yesterday. So that's it, folks. You're going to use the graph editor. You're going to pop it open. In this graph editor, make sure that it's only going to show you the rig you got selected, so make sure you're selected on the main control rig. Don't mess with this other stuff. We're just really messing today with the translate Y, getting the bottoms fixed up with these sharp linear accelerations towards the bottom. So get these fixed up. Again, you're going to weight your curve, weight your tangent under curves. Make sure you free the length. And then for the bottom ones, you got to break the tangents. So for the rotate X, you're just going to clear out all your keyframes except for the first. Add in a new keyframe at the end for your end rotate. Rotate it like, negative 900, negative 1,000, negative 1,100. Find what looks good for you. Tweak with the acceleration curve on the rotate X a little bit to get it to look as good as you can. And that is it. So thank you for checking out the video. And thanks for making some good ball bounces. And thank you. Later.